At 08:57 a.m. on August 17, 1943, over the North Sea, a lone B-17 Flying Fortress fell out of formation and began drifting west, slow, damaged, and visibly unstable. Its left wing trailed smoke. One engine was already dead. Another was failing. The nose section was partially open to the wind, and the aircraft could no longer hold its assigned altitude. 40 minutes later, that same aircraft landed at its base in eastern England. 7 men walked away. According to U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine, a heavy bomber that lost formation at combat altitude over Germany, while suffering asymmetric thrust, structural damage, and degraded control authority, had almost no chance of survival. Statistical projections from 1943 placed the probability of return for such an aircraft at effectively 0. Fighters targeted isolated bombers first. Flak batteries adjusted fire once a straggler revealed itself. Even without enemy action, the aircraft's own limits were often enough to finish the job. Yet that morning, ground crews watched an aircraft they had already written off approach the runway, low, fast, and unstable, but still under control. No emergency vehicles moved at first. The damage was so extensive that many assumed the bomber would break apart before touchdown. It did not. There was no dramatic maneuver on final approach, no last-second correction, just a controlled descent of a machine that should not have been capable of controlled flight. When the wheels touched down and stayed aligned, the silence along the runway said more than any cheer could have. This was not a story of perfect flying. It was a story of an aircraft kept alive minute by minute after the system that was supposed to protect it had already failed. The mission was part of the combined raid against German industrial targets in Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The objective was simple on paper: destroy aircraft assembly lines and ball-bearing production. The cost was understood in advance. B-17 formations flew at altitudes between 24,000 and 27,000 feet. At that height, oxygen deprivation was constant. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Metal contracted. Hydraulic fluid thickened. Human reaction time slowed, even with supplemental oxygen. German air defenses were layered. Heavy flak near major cities. Lighter flak along transit corridors. Fighter bases positioned to attack bombers once escort fighters turned back. The most dangerous phase of any mission was not the bomb run itself, but the long withdrawal afterward, when damaged aircraft began to fall behind. The B-17 was designed to survive damage while staying in formation. Survival depended on mutual protection. A lone bomber was a different equation. Once separated, it faced concentrated fire without support, and every maneuver increased stress on an already compromised airframe. On that morning, visibility was good, which meant enemy gunners could see clearly, and fighters could choose their angles. When the aircraft in question was hit, it was still deep over enemy territory, with hundreds of miles of hostile airspace between it and safety. The aircraft commander, Captain William Harper, was 28 years old. Before the war, he worked as a delivery truck driver in Missouri. Long hours, mechanical breakdowns, improvised fixes on the side of the road. He learned early that machines rarely failed all at once. They failed in stages, and recognizing those stages mattered. His co-pilot, First Lieutenant Charles Ed Nolan, had studied mechanical drafting. He understood load paths and stress distribution, not as theory, but as something drawn in lines and angles. In the cockpit, Nolan paid attention to what the aircraft was telling them through vibration and resistance. The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Raymond Cole, had grown up in a railroad family. He understood weight, momentum, and how small imbalances became large problems at speed. On board, he managed fuel, power settings, and damage assessment. The rest of the crew were young men trained for specific roles. None were trained for improvisation beyond checklists. None expected to be alone over Germany. They had flown together long enough to trust short statements and long silences. That mattered more than enthusiasm. The B-17 was engineered around redundancy. 4 engines allowed continued flight after losses. Multiple control cables ensured survivability after damage. The aircraft could absorb punishment if the damage remained within expected patterns. Doctrine assumed formation integrity. It assumed damage would be partial. It assumed crews would have time to respond. What doctrine did not account for was cascading failure. One engine loss increasing yaw. Yaw increasing drag. Drag increasing structural stress. Stress enlarging existing damage. Once those processes began feeding each other, the aircraft was no longer operating within its design envelope. The system worked, until it didn't. The flak burst came without warning. Engine number 2 lost oil pressure and seized. The aircraft yawed hard left. Almost immediately, fighter fire tore through the nose section, injuring the bombardier and destroying the forward glazing. Harper had seconds to decide. Option 1 was bailout. Doctrine supported it. The aircraft was damaged. Formation was lost. Survival odds on the ground were unknown, but the aircraft might not remain airborne much longer. Option 2 was to attempt withdrawal at reduced altitude and speed, gambling that control could be maintained long enough to reach friendly airspace. Harper chose the second option, not because it was safer, but because it was still possible. With one engine dead and another operating irregularly, asymmetric thrust became the primary threat. Harper reduced power on the opposite wing to minimize yaw rather than maximize speed. Speed was no longer the goal. Stability was. Cole initiated fuel transfer to reduce imbalance. Small adjustments, no sudden shifts. Altitude was traded for control authority. Descending increased air density and rudder effectiveness. It also increased exposure. The descent was gradual. German fighters attacked in pairs. The aircraft could not maneuver aggressively. Gunners fired short bursts. Harper avoided sharp corrections that would overstress the damaged wing. A partial elevator control loss forced Harper to fly with trim adjustments rather than direct input. Nolan assisted by calling airspeed and pitch trends. Every minute airborne required active compromise. Reduce stress here. Accept risk there. Nothing was optimal. Approach presented the final problem. With limited control authority, Harper carried excess speed. He avoided a full flare. The landing was firm, but aligned. Once rolling, aerodynamic forces dropped away. The aircraft no longer needed to fly. The crew was exhausted. 2 men were wounded. 1 suffered frostbite. The aircraft was structurally compromised beyond repair. The after-action report documented the damage and decisions. No doctrine changed immediately. The aircraft was salvaged. Among crews, the story spread quietly. Weeks later, the aircraft's serial number was removed from the roster. On paper, it simply returned to base. In reality, it had crossed a boundary the system never planned for, and survived only because its crew recognized that staying alive sometimes meant flying an aircraft in a way it was never meant to fly at all.